let's talk about landing shows. My emoji did not work for this part of the presentation when it exported. I'm really sad. It was a handshake emoji. I'm sure everybody has seen it, but I'm going to start with the most effective, the most sustainable things, and then go down from there. All right. Because you can always outreach to 1 million people. But for me, it was about midway through 2019 that I realized I love to network, right? I'm obsessed with building relationships and the value behind that. But networking can be really inefficient. And that's when I realized that who you network with makes a big, big difference. And if you're networking with people that have stages, it is like if you were networking with multiple people at once. And that's why in mid-2019, I started dedicating myself to going to podcaster conferences. I didn't have a podcast yet. Yes, I love podcasts and I listen to them or whatever. But in my head, I thought, hey, you know what? I go to trade shows, I go to conferences all the time, and I meet 25, 50 people a day. If I do that at a podcasting conference, I'm meeting 25, 50 people a day. Out of those 25 to 50 people, man, if 3 to 5 of them of each day that I meet invite me on their podcast, then I'm essentially, let's say an average of 100 listeners per show, somewhere between 100 to 500, right? Like I'm essentially meeting 300 to 2,500 people a day. Because if I come on their show, I can now, speak to their audience. And that is a big, big avenue of distribution. So the idea that prioritizing creator conferences and creator events for yourself is a huge, huge investment that you can make in your network. Because what ends up happening is at first it's you're meeting them, you're building the relationship, and you start going on their shows, you build your own personal brand. But what ends up happening is if you follow up with those relationships, you build those networks, not only are you able to, whenever you need to announce something, you can go, boom, make 5 emails, radio row, and you go get on everybody's stages, which is the way that we have done to promote our boot camps in the past. But let's say you meet a really high value person. Imagine being able to introduce that person to 5 podcasters, get that person on 5 podcasts, 10 podcasts, 25 podcasts, whatever. It is a super high value add thing that you can do in order to A, allow yourself to spread a message, or B, allow others to spread their message and build really, really high profile relationships that really pay. So going to creator conferences is something that I highly, highly recommend that you put a different price point than the average conference that you go to just to acquire clients, because it has this really long tail positive effect. Cheryl's asking me to identify what a creator conference would be. Cheryl, I don't know what it is exactly in your niche of leadership, but what I can tell you is that there is multiple podcasting conferences that you get in there and you start meeting people like that, right? So for example, there is Podfest, which I really, really like. That is a very community-based podcasting conference. You meet smaller podcasters, but very, very approachable. There's Podcast Movement, which is more of a professional kind of circuit. You meet the bigger podcasts there. Like if you get a VIP ticket there, you get in the back room with some like real influential audiences. And then there's other local ones, right? I know there's a good one in Austin. There's a good one in Boston as well. And that's a really good way to just start doing it. Other things are like FinCon, for example. FinCon is this conference for financial education content creators, right? Not really podcasting, not really YouTube, not whatever, but financial education content creators. So that's great if you're a financial advisor, if you're a fintech software, if you're a real estate investment company, right? All these different things. So there's multiple different niches. Now what I'm starting to see is on LinkedIn, the people on LinkedIn that have built really good audiences on LinkedIn, like a Nick Bennett is starting, or even James Carberry, they're starting to have creator events, right? I saw a creator summer camp that Sweetfish Media is hosting, or Nick Bennett is putting this like B2B content creator trip to Costa Rica, right? So I attribute very different value to those events, because if you go in there and you meet these people and you make those connections, right? Like, especially those quaint ones are really, really great to build those like tight relationships, because you're not going to necessarily do business with them, but you can definitely up your creator skill set is kind of what they're selling, but that network, that ability to collaborate with them is super, super valuable. So I just encourage you to look at those things. Oh, Miko Ivanov is in the house. He's adding some podcast show London, right? Miko is a great podcast booking agent as well. So somebody to connect with. So that's networking in person, right? Like to me, that is the highest value. You can't do it all the time, but I really do recommend, maybe it doesn't have to be a podcasting event, right? Maybe it's a blogger conference or, something like that. I've seen local newspapers like the Jacksonville Business Journal. Actually, I don't think I've seen it in Jacksonville, but in Miami, the South Florida Business Journal will promote their events of like, come meet the reporters, right? That to me, I add a special value to those events, right? Because if you can meet people that have platforms, strike up the right relationship, it sparks a whole wildfire that we're going to talk about some more here, right? So I just really highly encourage thinking about that, adding that to your business development and your travel plans. Then there's LinkedIn, right? Then there's online. And I have a specific way that I like to approach people that I'm trying to build a relationship online, specifically these content hosts, right? Or people that have, are a bigger deal than me. What I'll start with is a follow, right? I won't immediately connect with them. I won't make an ask. I'll just follow. On LinkedIn, you can now turn that bell on and be notified of the people that you really, really want to build a relationship with every single time they post. And once they do that, I'm in there liking and commenting on their stuff, right? I know that JD gives a really, really good framework around like making it a valuable like or comment. I completely agree with that strategy. When it is someone that you are trying to just get on the radar, sometimes quantity is good, right? Just like commenting, being in there, but definitely be looking at adding value inside the content, right? If you can see something that they said and add an extra insight and ask them an insightful question that allows them to iterate on that, there's a strong likelihood that you're going to land on their radar. They're going to respond to you. You do that a couple of times, it opens the door to actually connect, right? If that isn't working, there's always the idea of sharing their content, right? So like I'll start by following them. I'll start liking and commenting. My next step is to take something that they did, share it within my own network, right? Either a retweet or a share on Facebook or a share on LinkedIn, and add my own write-up of what I learned from this tip and go connect with this person, right? Writing up a special introduction to meet this person, go check out their podcast, whatever you got to do, right? Most people share, and that's great. Like if you just share, it's valuable and the person will see it as valuable. But if you take that extra time to like contextualize it to your audience, make it obvious that you listen and make it obvious that what the value is, there's a higher likelihood that someone else is going to key into that. And there's a higher likelihood that creator is going to be like, oh man, this person's really, helping me out. I definitely want to connect with this person. Next step beyond that is making an original piece of content of something that you learned from them, tagging them in it and referencing them. These are no ask things. You're just building the relationship. You're adding value. That same exact kind of like framework, those 4 steps was what it took for me to land on Christopher Lochhead's radar, right? The author of Play Bigger, the godfather of category design that I really, really care about. Once they start engaging with you, boom, connection request. Now you can really start building that relationship. And once you're connected, what I love to do is send people their way, right? Like if you start introducing people to each other, you're going to be seen as a person of value, right? And again, I'm saying this because there's a lot of asks of podcasters, right? But the more value you add to their life, the more the chance that they're going to put you on their show. I'm going to just call out, I'm going to call out Michael, right? Michael Haynes in the audience right now, right? Like we've had a conversation now. I'm about to, Michael, spoiler alert, I'm about to invite you to come on the show. I've been reading your book and I really want to talk about the listen part of Listen, Innovate, and Grow. But Michael is a perfect example of how to build that relationship, right? Like he started commenting on my stuff. Then he started sharing some of it. Then he started tagging people in it. Then we hopped on, he started coming to the show. We hopped on a call. We built the relationship. I've gotten to know what he does. And now it's a no-brainer for me to have him come on the show, right? So it's like that idea of real, genuine relationship building is what's going to get you the best opportunities and really good opportunities to get interviewed by a host that really knows who you are and is really trying to do their best to promote you, right? So there's nothing more valuable than really building the relationship with a podcast host. I'm actually, April 1st, I'm going to the wedding of my favorite first podcaster, right? Justin Schenk built the relationship the same exact way, right? Different world. He's not so much in the B2B, but just has one of these like top 5 podcasts for entrepreneurs in Inc. magazine. And the same way, just like showing up in his comments, sharing his stuff, introducing his podcast to people, promoting it, doing all these things, eventually got me on his show. I've been to his conference. I brought people to his conference, and now I'm like invited to his wedding, right? So nothing beats real relationship building when it comes to hosting, guesting on other platforms. And as you're doing this, right, as you're landing these shows, there's a real value in the small shows that you start off with, right? You don't have to start off with trying to get on the Joe Rogan Experience, or even, like I haven't been on like Lockhead's podcast, right? Follow Your Different. Haven't been on that thing. It's definitely above my skis, but that doesn't stop me from building that relationship with him. But it also doesn't stop me from building a relationship on any podcast, any small podcast that I can. That's Tilo in the background. I don't know what he's barking at, but any podcast that I can, because of a couple of reasons. Number one, the small shows are often the ones with more engaged audience than you think. When someone's just getting started and it's literally just like the 50 people that really know him that are listening to his show, the proximity, like the feeling of like, man, I can really reach out to this person is very real. When I was first starting my podcast journey, I was going on a handful of shows, right? Because I started the whole thing by networking at Podcast Movement, and I was getting on a bunch of different shows. And for whatever reason, people coming on my show, right? When I had my smallest audience, right? I had maybe like 30, 40 downloads an episode. They were often getting people reaching out to them on their call to action, on their connection request, on their lead magnet, on their free trial to whatever. And I often got the feedback like, man, I go on much bigger shows and I don't get this kind of response. And the reason why is because everybody that was listening to that show at that point was somebody that actually knew me. So coming on, that lending of credibility was very real, right? So small shows have real value for you transactionally. And the other thing that small shows provide is value for reps. Right, man, the first couple of podcasts that I went on, I re-listened to them. I was rambling. My message wasn't completely clear. I had a fun conversation, right? I'm still an energetic guy, but my message wasn't super clear. It wasn't until I got into 50 and 60 reps of being on other podcasts, on hosting the podcast myself, that I started really understanding how to communicate on podcasts. So as you're getting started, don't sweat the small show stuff. Like, do it, right? Like, go do it. Get that rep, show up like if it's the biggest show ever, and be fully prepared because you want to practice how you play, right? Like you want to really refine that stuff. And there really is an opportunity there, no matter how small it is. Get on the small shows and do it. And then what that opens up is, this is one of the most interesting thing anybody has ever shared as a guest of my podcast that just blew me away. I had Elizabeth Pampalone on an episode. Ryan, maybe you can look up what number episode that was and share it in the chat. But Elizabeth in 2020 guested on 200 podcasts, right? Like she was this fanatical networker that figured out that, man, if the world's going to shut down, how am I going to go meet more people? Podcasting, right? So she got on 200 podcasts, and she gave me this really innovative strategy that she used. And it's that she parlays smaller shows that she's been on that have a relation to the next show that she wants to be on to get in bigger and bigger shows. Here's what I mean. She would look up somebody that was a bigger guest on a smaller show that she had been on, look up the different podcasts that bigger guest had been on, and reach out to those hosts and say, oh, I saw that you had this person on your show. I was on a show that person was on. Here's what I talk about. And it worked. It worked for her, right? Like she was able to like parlay up the daisy chain. In blogs, that's actually a thing that Ryan Holiday wrote about. It's like parlaying the daisy chain when it comes to PR and media. He would pitch a small story for like a small newspaper and then use that small newspaper story to pitch it to a bigger newspaper, and then use that bigger newspaper story to pitch it to like a national magazine, and so on and so forth. You can do that with podcasts, right? And it doesn't just have to be the guest. You can do it based on the guest. You can do it based on the topic, right? So if you have been on, if the podcast that if you've been on a podcast for physicians, for example, right? Like if JD is going on finance for physicians, then the next podcast that he does for doctors, he can say, oh, hey, like you got a doctor's audience. I've spoken on this other one with a doctor audience too, right? Like, and it can be a really small show, right? Finance for physicians is actually a pretty big show. They get like 600 downloads per episode. But even if it's really, really small, right? Like even if it's doctors that care about X and it's maybe the first episode, he can still use that as credibility on the next doctor podcast to get on another one with maybe a bigger audience, right? So like think about the overlaps between the shows you've been on and what the subject is, and look for other shows in that subject and use that as a way to get on other shows. Or, who was the biggest guest that you have shared the stage with, and then find out where that guest has been and go reach out to those podcast guests and those podcasts to get on. It is a great, great strategy. Oh, Roanne just shared it in the chat. It's episode 184 if you're listening. So that episode with Elizabeth is one of the best of all time. I highly, highly recommend it. If you're listening to the podcast or if you're watching right now, you haven't seen that, go check that one out. She's brilliant.